Great, hello, welcome to the session on Feminist Approaches 101. So firstly, we'd like to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on unceded Algonquin territory. And this session is going to be facilitated by Samantha McGavin from Interpares, Dara Title from Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, and myself, Francesca Rhodes from Oxfam Canada. So when planning for this workshop, we decided to focus in on what a feminist approach means, what adopting one looks like in practice, and how our work would look different through a feminist approach. We're not attempting to decode Canada's feminist international assistance policy or tell you how to respond to it. So we know there are other spaces and conversations that are going on with global affairs where that conversation is taking place. But what we're really focusing on is the fundamentals of a feminist approach and what for civil society we think that means for our work. The first part of the session is a presentation from our three organising partners. And then we will then be hearing from international speakers on their experiences of adopting a feminist approach. There'll be some space for reflections from the floor following those presentations, but then we'll move into group work, which will be really a chance to discuss and apply some of the principles that we presented to your work and to your organisations. So at the moment, if you have a very small group on your table and you prefer to be in a larger group for the conversations, now might be a good time to make sure that you're on a table with enough people for those, so to move around a bit. And to give some background to the session and the content, our organisation and others are part of the Women's Rights Policy Group, which has been working together in Canada on ideas which feature heavily in this presentation for some time. So last year, a workshop was held to put together ideas on a feminist approach to international assistance, and you can read about the outcomes of that in a paper which we released. There are English copies on the tables, I think, and French copies are available at the back. And we're also happy to talk to any organisations that are not currently part of the Women's Rights Policy Group, but would be interested in joining and working together on this agenda moving forward, and particularly around engaging global affairs with the conversation. So we thought we'd start with a definition firstly, but recognising, of course, that there are many different definitions of feminism out there and different interpretations of what it means. But we really wanted to ground our session in this first definition of a feminist approach. So for us, it's really important to make clear that a feminist approach must seek to address the root causes of structural and systemic inequalities and to transform systems of power. So this is explaining a bit about how a feminist approach is not just about targeting women and girls for assistance, but it's about recognizing that many of these unequal systems of power are grounded in social constructions of gender and in patriarchal attempts to control women's bodies and choices. Applying this approach to different forms of power and thinking more broadly about power relations within our work and how we can seek to address their unequal basis is an important part of the feminist approach. And my colleagues are going to speak a bit more in detail about what this means.
This session is called 101, not because we think this stuff is a piece of cake, but because we want to start with first principles. For our organizations, there are three key principles to the implementation of a feminist approach: intersectionality, agency, and process. Intersectionality is a framework that recognizes the multiple aspects of identity that play out in our lives and our experiences, such as class or skin color, and that compound and exacerbate oppression and marginalization. Intersectionality also challenges us to expand our understanding of gender beyond binaries of woman or man, femininity or masculinity, and allows us to identify and address complex contexts. Intersectionality is fundamental to how feminism sees the world and how it works. If we bring an intersectional perspective when we program and work, we ask ourselves questions like, which women's voices are privileged in our spaces and which are absent? Do we risk promoting some women's rights at the expense of others? Or how do our efforts address the realities of women living multiple forms of marginalization and oppression? Agency is an individual or group's ability to make choices and to transform those choices into desired outcomes. Feminist agency includes principles of autonomy, choice, empowerment, and meaningful engagement. Agency allows us to recognize that individuals are experts and knowledge holders in their own rights. If we focus on agency, then our priorities include responsive programming that relies on women's rights organizations' contextual analysis and focuses on their priorities, recognizing and upholding women's rights organizations as experts and leaders, not reducing them to project implementers, supporting programs that aim to enhance women's agency and self-determination. Critically, a feminist lens is not just about results, but about process. Fundamental to feminist process are integrity, contextualization, learning, collaboration, participation, inclusivity, and responsiveness. If we are committed to process, then we value things like investing in relationships, people, and organizations, not just in executing projects, listening, especially to grassroots women and to marginalized voices, reflecting on our practice and learning together, creating horizontal collaborative spaces where different voices can be heard and can contribute, and approaches for measuring results, impact, and attribution that leave room for qualitative analysis, complexity of change of mechanisms, which are often nonlinear, and nuance. We should also note that in practice, a feminist lens must go hand in hand with a human rights-based approach to international assistance, as both frameworks position rights holders and their needs at the center. This means shifting from a supply-driven approach, which prioritizes service delivery, to a demand-driven approach that positions individuals' needs and realities at the center of all initiatives. Ultimately, a feminist approach must challenge systemic inequality, unjust power systems, discriminatory laws, policies, and programs at local, national, regional, and global levels. So it's a very modest agenda. Integrity and coherence are fundamental to feminist work. It's difficult to look at a feminist approach to international development in isolation from a whole-of-government approach. Sustainable development goals are often spoken of as interconnected. This interconnection is what makes everything messy and complicated, but the acknowledgement of these connections is one of the first steps to a feminist approach.
So just getting a little bit deeper into some of these concepts, I wanted to discuss not the way that these things are the same, but the way that these things are different. So a human rights-based approach, as we all know, or human rights in general, are developed in the early 40s and place the rights holder at the center of a legal framework. It comes under almost immediate criticism for neglecting the needs and specific realities of women. And then a gender equality approach or a women's rights approach gets discussed. Both of these things are important, and many organizations over the past decade have adopted a human rights and gender equality-based approach, which is great, but neither encompass the needs of feminism. So, Hillary Clinton is oft quoted as saying women's rights are human rights, as a way of sort of making it important that we continuously think about women in the center of a human rights-based approach. Feminism, however, works outside of legal frameworks in order to fundamentally transform power. And one thing that a human rights-based approach does not do is include movement building at the heart of it. So it is important for us to consider activism, movement building, and transformations of society and power and structures when we discuss feminism, not simply think about it in terms of a human rights-based approach. And there's a quote that illustrates that. The project to achieve substantive equality cannot be achieved by rights alone. It requires the radical transformation of society. So I wanted to sort of sidestep the lesson just a little bit to address what I find to be sort of an elephant in the room over the last couple years, which is the question of men and boys inside of a feminist framework. In the past decade or two, most of the development sector has moved towards acknowledging women's rights, which is extremely important. And most groups are adopting gender focuses, which we love. But in the past few years, there has been a shift towards a focus on men and boys within the gender focus, which has garnered quite a lot of political and financial support. I want to give a quote in order to illustrate this, which came off the floor of the UN when the Violence Against Women Special Rapporteur spoke in 2014. Gender, stripped of the idea of male privilege and female subordination, came to mean that women and men suffer equally at the hands of existing gender orders. Women's organizations were increasingly asked, if you were working on gender, then where are the men? And they were increasingly pressured to include men. On the heels of this pressure, a new actor came into focus, men's organizations. The existence of already weakened women's organizations was now further threatened, and feminist attempts at movement building faced additional challenges. The increased focus on men and men's organization is seen as a new fad, the latest silver bullet to achieving gender equality, and it's a threat to women's organizations and the women's movement. In this view, donor attention to men's organizations seemed to signify a shift of support away from women's empowerment and women's leadership, and a handing over of the reins of the struggle for gender equality to men. Men are once more in charge, only this time they are in charge of women's liberation struggles. End quote. It's important to think about the fact that one of the strategies associated with this is the engagement of men and boys and the appeal to the idea that women deserve respect as their mothers, sisters, wives, and so on. Emphasizing personal relationships is said to make it easier for people and governments to understand the consequence of violence against women. But women as rights-bearing individuals, irrespective of their marital status, are considered too radical a concept to attract support. And that notion also reinforces the public-private dichotomy. So really, we have to fundamentally challenge and question the men and boys agenda. Is it just reinforcing patriarchal norms of men as protectors and by extension women as victims as a method of ending violence, or and it is also important to mention that feminism has always targeted and addressed men and boys as being allies and partners in the struggle for dealing with misogyny and hypermasculinity and ending violence. That's not new to feminism. But the focus of centralizing men and boys within a feminist movement is something that we believe needs to be challenged at this stage in history.
So we're now going to hear from our three invited international guests. And of course, the group work is really the chance for us to bring out the Canadian context of this. So one of us is here in person, and two are then going to be joining us by video to share their perspectives. And the idea was to share with you the insights of an organization which decided to adopt a feminist approach and what that looked like, and maybe what some of the challenges were, but then also the perspective of organizations which were founded in a feminist approach and what that looks like. So now I'd like to introduce David Archer, who is here with us. He's the head of program development with ActionAid International, having been head of education for many years. He manages the Right to Education project, is a co-founder and board member of the Global Campaign for Education, and for many years was an elected civil society representative on the board of the Global Partnership for Education. In 2012, he compiled ActionAid's resource book on the human rights-based approach, People's Action in Practice, and he has led the process of critical review and reflection about a human rights-based approach over the past 5 years.
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here with you. ActionAid made a specific and clear commitment to move to a human rights-based approach back in 1998, and right from the beginning of committing to a human rights-based approach, put women's rights at the centre, ensuring that all strategies that we've followed since then both have women's rights as a standalone priority and also mainstream through all of our other work. I do think it's taken somewhat longer to commit ourselves to working with a feminist approach, which has been built up over the last 5 years. Many of the elements that have been articulated here are central to the way in which we work with the feminist human rights-based approach, including a real priority on the centrality of women and women's active agency. And I'd certainly echo the fear that we see with the sort of tendency to focus on men and boys, which in many cases is, I think, undermining the space and financing for women's organizations. If we're building the active agency of women, we need to be looking at women's leadership, women-led organizations, women's organizations, and specifically feminist organizations as key partners. Working with an intersectional approach is certainly a priority, and I think it's one of the really important insights of a feminist approach to really look at the multiple layers and dimensions of exclusion, whether by class, race, rurality, sexuality, religion, disability, but always with that central focus on women. At the core of the way in which we've worked with the rights-based, a feminist rights-based approach has been about creating safe spaces for women and to support processes of critical thinking and conscientization, linking a sort of reflection on a women's condition and positions to action for justice. And of course, trying to create a participatory process and a democratic space in any community is itself countercultural, because in every context and in every group there will be all sorts of power dimensions at work, and we need to recognize, name, and challenge power in all of its forms. I think one of the challenges of moving to a feminist approach within a human rights-based approach is that the human rights-based approach framework puts a lot of focus on citizen action as rights holders to challenge the duty bearer of the state. And that tends to mean that you end up focusing a lot on visible power, the visible power of the state. And it can mean that you don't do enough work to address hidden power, whether that's the hidden power of corporate entities, for example, or the military in many cases. But more importantly, it means that you're not putting sufficient attention on invisible power, the sort of patriarchy, social and cultural attitudes that undermine the space for women's voice and for processes of change. So if we're serious about working with a feminist approach, we need to be putting a critical analysis of power relationships and looking at invisible power in particular right at the heart of our work. And we need to look at shifting power and power relationships at every level, from the individual through household, through groups, community, district, national and international levels. It is about systemic and structural change at every level. One of the things that we have found, I think, really important when we've reviewed our experiences in different parts of the world with using a feminist rights-based approach has been the importance of recognizing that change is never linear. And it's one of the things which is a real challenge to, I think, the aid industry, which is so much dominated by short-term projects where you sort of have to decontextualize things, pretend nothing happened before you turned up, run a project which has got clear objectives and an end point with clear milestones, and then declare your success at the end of it. And there's a tendency to see change processes in a rather simplistic and linear way, when in fact change is much more complex and much more messy. And one of the real insights, I think, from working with feminist movements is to recognize the significance of backlash, that when you're in a process of change, you can make certain amount of progress, and then you will, in many cases, encounter backlash to that process, which can mean that you think you're going forward, you're going backwards, and then you can move forward again in responding to that backlash. But that doesn't sit very comfortably with traditional log frames, theories of change and project design. And I think it does have implications for the way in which we design and conceive development programs. I would say one of the most important things that we have emphasized, particularly most recently, is that what matters is who you actually hang out with. Are you connected with feminist movements in the different countries where you're working? And unless you're actually connecting with the existing movements, don't try to reinvent something. You need to actually sort of build and strengthen those existing movements, and they exist both at an international level and a national level in most countries, and the key challenge is to strengthen those movements and those voices. I think in the process we also need to be willing to consistently, critically analyse our own power as institutions, as organisations, look at the way in which power is practised internally within our institutions, and recognise that actually sometimes the structures that we have, the ways in which we work can create challenges for effective work with feminist movements. I think what we've certainly across Action Aid sort of invested a lot in feminist leadership training across the organisation, but we've also made a very clear commitment to overhaul all of the partnerships that we have at a national and international level to try to make sure that we are working with the right partners. But it also affects the sort of recruitment and induction processes of staff. You need to be consciously recruiting with to identify and to recognise that actually women, bringing on women and bringing on those with a feminist approach is actually itself an important criteria in a recruitment process and should be a big part of any induction process. We can't take these things for granted. And it does require, I think, a sort of a cultural change in many organisations. We tend to, in the development industry, think of ourselves as recruiting a group of experts. And actually what we're increasingly recognising in Action Aid is the real priority is to recruit a network of activists rather than experts, people who are really involved in struggles and part of the struggle for change and for challenging power dynamics at every level. I think I'll leave it there for now, and we'll go on to discussion. Thanks.
I'm Carrie.
And together we will share with beautiful Canadian people how we run our feminist organization. And this is how we try.
Do you introduce yourself a bit more? Okay, ready to go.
I'm executive director of Canada, which is an organization based in Buenos Aires and part of the Central Rights Initiative.
My name is Carrie Shaw, and I'm the Advocacy Manager of the Coalition of African Lesbians, and CAL is an explicitly feminist Pan-Africanist organization, membership-based, and we have members across the continent, with more members in Southern Africa, East and West and Central Africa, and we're an advocacy organization that advances the rights of all women on the continent.
Ready? Ready. Our organization was created as a feminist organization because even though members of Canada have been working in different international organizations, also working in sexuality and gender, those organizations didn't have a feminist role. So from the beginning we decided that one of our principles were to be a feminist organization.
So CAL also started with a very explicit articulation of the need for a feminist organization, and it was really against the backdrop of a continent that gets spoken about, that gets used in a way to extract out whether it's the natural resources but also the experiences and the realities of people. And so very often the experience was that people's lives were spoken about and not by themselves. And so CAL came about as a way to really strengthen the voices of African queer women and lesbian women, to be able to self-articulate what their priorities were, but also to come up with solutions. And so in that there was a very clear articulation that the problem
and the solution of power. So it was a very explicit analysis of power and how power was operating within movements, within organizations, but also geopolitically. And so so Cal was really, that was at the origins of it, and it's even articulated in the first constitution of Cal and has sort of remained present throughout. Of course, you know, it's also one thing to put feminism down on paper and to make sure that that's our ideological basis, but to actually live that every day, I think, remains an ongoing work.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the challenges can be to, I mean, because I think the other reality is that there's so many different flavors of feminism, right? And I think that sometimes in an organization you may get to a place where everyone in the organization, at every level, or if it's a flat organization, no matter what they're doing for the organization, that they ascribe to feminism, but then there may be differences of opinion around particular issues, right? Yes. And so I think to never take for granted or assume that just because people are saying or calling themselves feminist and so on, that there's absolute agreement or understanding. So to really invest in consciousness raising in the organization around that, and then to figure out how will you deal with it when there is disagreement on something, and not to become too you know, to say like, well, if you disagree on that, then you have no place within this organization. So how expansive can you be around that? But I really think that there's no shortcut around reaching that kind of common ground around what are we talking when we say we're a feminist organization, and really taking time in process. And I think pushing back against donors who are very output driven and very outcome driven, which is not helpful when you need to, you know, go through processes and give them the time and energy and political space that they need. So to be prepared to get into some conflict with donors, when sometimes when sometimes the outcome that you had listed on the proposal now looks like something completely different, because actually it no longer meets what our common political analysis is.
Yeah, and I think it's important for this decision-making processes to have an open and honest dialogue within the organization. That we encourage the dialogue every time, mostly when we have a controversial issue within the organization. What related to donor is crucial to always challenge them, and sometimes it's by principle not adjust our agenda for donors. That usually happen in the movement.
I think that there is something, and I think the political project of establishing a feminist organization that really does try to work around questions of power and how to organize, cognizant of how power operates, is very challenging. And I think as a regional organization, the ways in which we've struggled with that has been, what does it mean to be the organization that's regional as opposed to our members, which are often quite local and very often not even able or wanting to access resources. So the ways in which resources operate, the way in which as a regional organization we have access to particular kinds of spaces that our members don't. You know, if we're not very deliberate in managing how that relationship works, we can very easily start replicating the kinds of power relationships that exist everywhere else. So I think that has been a major thing for us, is how do we work with our members in ways that both are honest about the ways in which power is operating, but also to try and undermine those and challenge those in very practical day-to-day ways. So that's I think one thing. I think the other thing is that as one starts growing as an organization, and Cal certainly has done that over the years, it's very difficult to both accept funding and not kind of give in to the ways in which they expect an organization to become hierarchical, bureaucratic, and so on, which are very contrary to feminist ideology, right? Which would speak to a feminism that, you know, and certainly the kind of feminism we ascribe to is one that looks at collective decision making, you know, co-accountability, developing ideas and programs and so on that really speak to the lived realities, which often does not fit within donor models. And so really pushing back against that, I think, has been a second challenge for us, and ways that we're still trying to kind of grapple with. So I guess those for us have been two of the biggest things that we've tried to confront and deal with.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was about to say. I think the institutional system is not, it's preset from not a feminist perspective. So it's a daily challenge to deal not only externally, because the donors, the government requires for instance, require governance structure vertical, donors also, and it's a challenge for us. We have and we overcame this challenge in having two different, for instance, charge of organizational charges. Charges? No. Charters.
Yeah. Organogram.
Yeah, organogram.
Yeah.
One for outside, one for inside. So, and then the decision process is very horizontal, collective, and that's not the requirement for donors or from governments. And internally, it's a daily challenge because individuals also are set not in a feminist way too. So sometimes we have to deal with this.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's a matter of daily struggle with it and dealing with it and overcome. Always having fun. It's important for us. Self-care, self-care, well-being, not only individually but collectively in the organization.
I guess the question is quite difficult to answer in a short way, right? Because I think for Cal it's about the ways of working, very importantly, and not just the issues that we take on. And I think often that's where you really see the mark of feminist organizing, is where there's an actual deliberate approach to feminist ways of working. Because I think, many organizations will talk about the feminist agenda, and that's an outward focused thing. It's about the kinds of issues you take on and so on. But I think what's really important for Cal is the how we do that work. And that even in the ways that we do that work, that we are really challenged. First of all, that we're very self-reflective of the ways in which power are operating, and our own positionalities and standpoints, and how we relate to others around that. And then also, of course, as you were saying, like the decision-making processes. How do we do that? How do we really build consensus? And then also, of course, the issues that we are advocating around. And I think one of the things, so Cal has adopted what we call RALF, which is Radical African Lesbian Feminism. And we, each of those terms has its own sort of historical meaning and so on. But for us, when we put those words together, it really gives us a very distinctive way of doing our work. And for us, it means actively countering the kinds of ways in which our lives are explained by others. So it's about self-articulation. It's about recognizing that we don't live single-issue lives, that our lives are shaped by a number of different forces, and that it's important for us. So intersectionality for us is not about intersectionality of identity, but it's about recognizing intersectionality of oppressions and how all of those oppressions are shaping our lives all of the time, when we're in Geneva or when we're on the continent, and really working actively around that, and very much countering and pushing against a narrow, rigid identity politics and this kind of global agenda, which is not set by us. So I think it's all of that. Now, what that means very often is that Cal, and this I think is a little bit different when we're in the SRI, but in many of the other spaces that we're in, Cal is the lone voice. And very often the kind of critique that's brought against Cal is, you're such angry feminists. Like, why are you always so angry? And many times, you know, we've gone through external evaluations where one of the critiques that's come back has been, which has come from international partners or regional partners, is that we're aggressive. And, you know, for us, the question of whether we should be aggressive or diplomatic or whatever, all we're doing is we're speaking our truth. And that truth comes from very hard lessons and hard experiences. And to not speak our truth, we feel is anti-feminist. And so, you know, I think when one does get positioned in that way, the thing of really building proper partnerships, making sure that our members are going into those spaces properly prepared, and that there is good support that comes up, you know, surrounding that work is really crucial. Because I think actually being a feminist and then trying to be a feminist organization is very, very hard work, and it doesn't leave you with many friends.
Yeah, I think regarding the challenges that we are mentioning, it's a hard work because we need to constantly be questioning and challenging different positions in different spaces that then you became an evil person sometimes, and but it's a hard work to be challenging every time, every decision-making process, and internally and domestic spaces that we work and doing activism, advocacy, and so on. But at the end of the day, it's good. And one thing is another position is, even though we recognize that there are many human rights violations regarding to gender or sexuality, we never see ourselves as victims. So this is a very, very good position, a strong position in our organization, I think, in feminism way.
One of the really dominant discussions, particularly amongst feminists working in Southern Africa, I think, is the ways in which feminism has been characterized by liberal feminism, and in particular the way that's practiced by white feminists in the global north. And so there's certainly, you know, I think that there's a very strong push by Cal, but also by other black feminists on the African continent to assert an African feminism that I think it goes so much further than the kinds of demands that have been made by liberal feminism, right, in terms of equality and so on. And I think, so this is, I think, one of both the commitments made by African feminists and other feminists from the global south, is to truly a decolonial feminism, right, or to decolonize feminism. And I think that's really exciting and something that Cal is very involved in and interested in exploring. And I guess our Ralphness is a bit about that. I think the other thing, though, that we've seen has been attacks on feminism. You know, I think that there's been some really difficult conversations that's been held between trans activists and trans feminists and other kinds of feminists. And I think that this, you know, I think they're really important conversations that need to be had there. I worry that sometimes the ways in which those conversations are happening has been in quite violent ways and ways that don't open up discourse, rather that shut down spaces. And I think we must be very vigilant around that. Like, we don't want to practice a kind of feminism that silences others for fear of being labeled transphobic or whatever else, right? I think that part of what feminism offers is a way to have very difficult conversations, but in ways that are respectful and safe and so on. And I think this remains a second big challenge for us. And perhaps the last thing, which we thought we dealt with, but there seems to be a strong resurgence for this, is the role of working with men and boys in feminist movements and organizing. And, you know, I think coming from a long history of national work in South Africa, where we saw a very worrying trend of women's rights organizations being shut down, decrease of funding, and so on. And while while some organizations that work with men and boys have challenged this idea that it's not a direct thing, that money gets taken away from women's rights groups and then gets put to men and boys programs, I think that there are certain ways in which patriarchy operates, which mean that organizations that work with men and boys automatically are given more access to decision-making spaces and opportunities for resources and so on. And so, we ended up in a situation in South Africa where women's rights organizations were scaling back on advocacy, having to scale back on service delivery, and at the same time, organizations that were working with men and boys seemed to be growing more and more able to access really critical advocacy spaces. I think that, again, this is something else that we want to be talking about. But for me, what's really critical is that, men and boys can only ever be allies in this struggle, in the same way that white people can be allies in the anti-racist struggle. They cannot be at the forefront of that struggle. Yeah. And in a similar way, feminist movements and the struggle for women's liberation can only be led by women. It can only be led by women. And women of color, and women facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression. And men's role within that struggle has to be as allies and very clearly shaped by what the demands of those women are. Otherwise, I think the risks of us replicating the same ways of being and inevitably of patriarchal being, are very high.
I'm really concerned about what else I can add about what you say. The only thing I can say is that the situation that you have described mirrored perfectly what happened in Latin America. Discussions are the same, the challenges are the same, and the struggle is the same. I think it's a good starting for discuss cross-regional work between Cal and Nakahata.
Absolutely.
So we wanted to give a chance for you guys to do some speaking as well. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the fact that two of our guests are currently in Geneva and recorded their interventions, we don't have them here to do a proper Q&A, but we invite your reflections. Action Canada is one of the Sexual Rights Initiative partners, so if it's a question directed at Fernando or Carrie that I can perhaps answer, I will do my best. But otherwise, we have David here, and we would love to hear your interventions. However, please do confine your comments to less than a minute, and I will be pretty vigilant about cutting you off. No offense. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to say?
Hello?
Oh, and there will be, Nika will be running around with a handheld mic.
So just put up your hands and I can come to you with the microphone.
There's a woman over here.
So I'll try to formulate this. I heard a lot about aggression, violence, and resistance in the presentation, and I was just wondering what the relationship was between nonviolence and feminism as it plays out in the organizations.
David, would you like to answer that? Or, yeah, let's take a couple. That's right. And please, can I ask you to introduce yourself when you speak?
Hi, I'm Rita Morbia from Interpares. I'm interested in David's reflections on different experiences with donor agencies, because there are, some of the Scandinavians as well have, considered themselves feminist donors in one way or the other, and other donor countries obviously don't. So I wondered, in your experience, because you're an international agency, having taken this position, what kinds of differences you see in your relationships?
Thank you. And just a reminder that there's a lot of wisdom in the room, and you don't have to frame your intervention as a question if you don't like.
Hi, Steve Stewart from Co-Development Canada. It's more an observation around this somewhat worrying trend of shifting funding, or like once you shift to the term gender rather than women's rights and the shift to men and boys. But I think there are also other ways that that's somewhat dealt with. Our organization has traditionally worked with teachers' organizations in Latin America around women's leadership, and after more women sort of began to assume the national leadership, they said they wanted to focus more on, as teachers, teaching within the classrooms around equality, and they created a teaching approach called non-sexist and inclusive pedagogy. But they began to include more men in the training, and initially we pushed back on it and sort of said, well, no, this funding is supposed to be for women and women's leadership. And their argument, and I think it touches on to the concept of the allies, was we don't want to have to do all the work. And so we want to train men also in addressing discrimination against women. And the workshops that they have developed in incorporating men, or sometimes on new masculinities, are run by the women's secretariats, but they have included men into it. So I think there's sometimes times when men need to be or can be trained as allies without the women's organizations relinquishing the power or assuming the funding.
Je vais poser une question en français. Je vais vous laisser le temps de mettre vos écouteurs. Alors, bonjour, Michel Asselin de l'Association québécoise des organismes de coopération internationale. J'ai une grande préoccupation. Pour moi, une approche féministe veut dire travailler avec des groupes féministes. Donc, comment le financement qu'on va obtenir va conserver l'autonomie de ces organisations féministes et leur radicalisme. Et c'est un grand défi. J'aimerais vous entendre sur cette question.
Merci. Autre question? Ou comment? Oui.
Hi, my name is Fatu, and I'm with the Match International Women's Fund. And just a reflection that it was also points that were touched upon by Carrie about feminism being intersectional, and also just that women of color and other women need to be at the center and their voices need to be heard. And just a reflection in this room, and thinking about feminism, where are the women of color? And where are their voices within the panel here, and as well as the two individuals that spoke earlier on? Just something that I thought of.
Is there any other commentary, reflections, or questions? If not, I will pass this over to David to respond to some of what was heard.
I'll try to give some response. I'm sure others will also have other comments to make. I mean, I think we, in terms of the non-violence and feminism and ActionAid, and I think all of the organisations here are committed to a non-violent approach where this is foundational to how we work. So I don't think it's something which is in tension in any way. I think we can, we can advance the feminist struggle without resorting to violence, and we need to articulate that perhaps more strongly sometimes than we do. I think the donors, it is a massive challenge how we, a lot of it's unintentional as well. I think it's, as I think I sort of alluded to, one of the biggest challenges is when donors, is the very nature of the sort of short-term project cycles, and increasingly this focus on sort of elaborating very detailed sort of outcomes and the focus on outcomes. And it was touched on earlier about the importance in a feminist approach of valuing the process of change. And that's something which a lot of existing formats and ways of working don't easily facilitate. And as I alluded to, I think given so often that processes of backlash to, in a sense, backlash can be seen as a really powerful indicator that you're doing something right. In fact, if you're really challenging power, there should be a backlash. And if there is an absence of a backlash, you might say that you haven't really challenged or shifted things in the fundamental way that you should. But if you're going to recognize that, you really need to be able to sort of offer continuity of support to the struggles that you're part of. And that means getting outside of 3-year project frameworks and looking at longer term programs of support. And that's not always as easy as we would like. So I think there is a dialogue with donors, both about how you approach monitoring and evaluation of processes of change, how you value shifts of power, how you really get under the skin of some of that, and how you try to make sure that there's a sustained investment. I do think on the men and boys question, I think the biggest challenge is the diversion of resources. If there are additional resources that come in to support the engagement of men and boys, and especially if it's led by women's organisations in that process, that's fine. But I think at the moment one of the real problems has been that there's been a lack of financing overall for women's movements, and the trend towards valuing the work with men and boys has tended to divert resources to organisations who work with men and boys, which are often not the women's movements themselves. And that's the thing which we need to really get to grips with. How do we work with feminist organisations and keep their autonomy and radicalism? I think that's also a challenge within the sort of donor frameworks. It is always going to be different when you are an international NGO or a donor organisation. Finding ways to work with movements needs a different mode of operation, and you need to recognise that it's some of the things that we would expect of traditional partners are not going to be easily delivered by organisations, because there's a tendency, I think, within all of the DA business for us to sort of seek partners who look like us and who are sort of mirror images of us or smaller versions of ourselves, and that is something which we need to get away from. I think we need to be looking for organisations that are radically different from us if we're wanting to be part of a radically different change process, which I think we really need to. And I think it's a very important challenge what you raise about the representation here on the panel. My colleague, my boss, who Everjoyce Wynne from Zimbabwe, would love to have been here, wasn't able to get over here, so I'm just sort of a pale substitute.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important that you raise the question of privilege and representation on this panel, and I think it is incumbent upon any allies and activists to locate their own privilege when they occupy public spaces. So thank you for raising that. Likewise, my boss, Sandeep, who is a person of color, would have been here, but he is very sick right now. Just briefly on the issues around men and boys that you raise, I think it goes beyond an issue of resource allocation, and it is a substantive question. It is very important that men do a lot of the labor when it comes to gender equality, because they are often in a position of privilege to do so. I work in a lot of social justice organizing committees where it's often women of color who sort of advise and work as elders, almost in an advisory capacity to create equity, and then they download that labor onto young, childless white men. So there are inventive structures arising out of social justice movements in order to deal with that labor imbalance and to make sure that it's not always incumbent upon women of color or people who are already suffering from intersectional oppression to do all of the work and to constantly be reiterating and defining themselves in public spaces among white privileged people. We do have to be careful, though, about creating two separate categories of men, good men and bad men, men who are violent, men who are trained not to be violent, and recognize that underneath all of that are harmful gender norms that require substantive challenging.
I don't want to repeat too much. I just wanted to pick up on Michelle's comment and question about working with feminist groups, that I think that it's very important that feminist organizations have political and financial allies. But also, if we're committed to long-term relationship building, we may have many partners who do not identify as feminist, and part of a feminist process for me is to start where people are at. And so I think if you have a long-term commitment to people who may be very central actors in their struggles who don't identify as feminists, we can still bring that interrogation of power and the horizontal approach to partnership building, and we can still bring that ethos and that approach and contribute that to the relationships that are there, as well as looking at what are other actors and people that we can bring into that work. So now we have work. Oh, we're not back on our. Can we go back to our PowerPoint? So we did that part. So now we're at the small group discussion part. So we have some questions for you to get you talking to each other. We haven't assigned discussion questions, but we would like each table to pick from one of these areas to talk about with each other. And we ask that one person at your table take some quick bullet point notes to then share afterwards with the group. So this is where you can bring in the Canadian reality, the Canadian context, as well as any experiences, of course, you have overseas. But you feel free to speak in the abstract or about your own organization in your conversations. And we wanted to underline that however well-implanted or not feminist practice is at our institutions, we all face challenges. We're all striving to learn and evolve. So we all come to this facing ways that we want to grow and learn together. And also, we wanted to underline that feminist practice is for everybody, regardless of their level of influence, whether we're an ED or a junior officer or an HR person or a finance director. There are always ways to integrate feminist principles into the way we work. So we'll give about 20 minutes for 15 minutes, 20 minutes for people to talk amongst themselves, and then we will come around with mics afterwards to share some of the learnings and comments and observations that were made at your table.
Okay, thank you. We can just wrap up conversations now. We have a bit of time now, just before lunch, to share any reflections or any key points from your discussion groups that you'd like to share with the rest of the participants. So we don't have time to go around every table, unfortunately, but we do have a roving mic. So if anyone would like to share their perspectives, you can raise your hand and the mic will be brought over to you. This group? Sorry?
Alors, je vais m'exprimer en français au nom de la table francophone. Et bien sûr, j'ai le privilège de prendre la parole pour mes collègues. Et nous, on a répondu aux questions 2. Et la réflexion qu'on se faisait ensemble, c'est qu'on a beaucoup développé des approches genre. Et là, on devrait peut-être revoir nos propres programmes politiques pour que nous, comme association, et on travaille ensemble, il faudrait avoir une approche féministe et bien définir les différences entre une approche féministe et une approche genre. Si on veut être en dialogue avec les donateurs, il faut bien savoir de quoi on parle. Alors, on trouvait que c'était un beau défi collectif que nous nous lançons. Et donc, c'est cette réflexion-là qu'on n'a pas fait le tour, mais on disait que si on ne sait pas se définir nous-mêmes, ça va être difficile d'établir de réels partenariats et de négocier, parce qu'il y aura toujours une négociation avec les donateurs, y compris Affaires mondiales Canada.
Hi, we didn't really get past the first line to any of the numbers, but in terms of the challenges in applying feminist principles, period, one of the dynamics around the table is there are a lot of NGOs working with very different partners. Some of the partners are more traditional and some of the partners are less traditional. I think there's a recognition that there's a distance to go between applying the sort of soft feminism that tends to be expressed in the feminist policy and what we're trying to do in women's empowerment, and the more systemic feminism that we would like to get to. But we have to start with where we're at, and then through advocacy and education, bring people along and bring ourselves along so we can have the conversations that we need to have to get to the more power structure questions.
Well, one of the, we didn't get to the questions except the monitoring and evaluation and learning, but again, it was the same discussion around the fact that in the policy, soft feminism, I don't know, but the feminism is actually not clearly defined about what they mean by that, where I want to comment that this panel really went deep into defining what a feminist approach was and how to apply it working, whereas the policy stays very silent on a definition of feminism. So yes, it's a challenge for us to maybe come up with a definition, but I also think this is an opportunity for the government to come up with a definition of feminism against which we are going to do this work, against which we are going to measure our work, against which we are going to be doing frameworks and log and PMFs and all of that. I think it's also an opportunity to ask them, because the panel did bring up some really interesting challenges. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to speak to that.
Sorry?
So maybe the table next to that group.
Nervous public speakers.
Hi. At our table, there was an interesting conversation on organizational culture and what it takes. Is it top-level leadership? Is it hiring new staff? When is the tipping point moment where you see you actually have a culture change? And recognizing that we're probably, as a sector, in that process, and then each individual organization there. And wondering also how long it will take us as a sector to get to that tipping point where it's not only lip service to feminism, but something that's embodied. And just a question mark at this point.
I think there was one over this side.
Which table?
So we, the radical feminists at the front, came up with a number 7. So we didn't talk about 1 through 6, or we talked about them all, and talked about the huge gap in public discourse around feminism and these principles. And we posed the question, how do you keep the principles of feminism alive and well, and also maintain the appeal to new groups? So widen the tent while maintaining a principle-based approach. And we talked about the scale and the momentum that is necessary in order to drive 1 through 6, more money, more thinking on this, better programming, better partnerships, takes more people talking about this in an intelligent way, and this sometimes conflicts with both our fundraising and our public engagement work.
Are there any tables that haven't spoken that would like to just give a flavour of what was discussed?
Unfortunately, probably like the others, not everyone got to participate as in-depth as the first couple people. I think we focused primarily on partnerships, and most of the organizations that are working with organizations in other countries sort of evaluated that we were more on the gender equity spectrum and only practicing some aspects of feminist principles around the areas of agency and challenging power, or questioning power relationships, I guess. Interesting is we have a number of researchers at our table as well, and there was unfortunately very brief but interesting reflection on those two questions in particular in the role of cross-border or international collaborative research. There's probably a few other things, but if anyone else wants to add. Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think at our table we had an interesting discussion about the local dynamics in working with our partner organizations in the field, and how the role the Canadian government can play in building political support with local governments and local institutions to back up the work that we're doing with our own organizations on the ground. And we talked about the challenges between addressing these issues at the root level, at the community level through projects, but also at a more systematic level through government-to-government interaction and multilateral engagement. And I think that was kind of the gist of what we discussed.
And I think there's one more on this side.
We discussed the same point as the last person spoke, but our idea was that it really had to be done at a very high level, and that in countries that were quite hard on NGOs, kicking NGOs out for doing any sort of advocacy, that even gender issues were difficult to bring up, that it really needed to be a high level. So we thought that we should have a whole program where Trudeau went in, and then there was a whole support system around that, and it was done at leader-to-leader level.
Great, thank you. Does any of the organisers or panellists want to make any final comments?
I'm not going to try to answer, but I do think it is an immensely wonderful opportunity that you have a policy that says it's a feminist policy at this level. And it would just be so wonderful if other bilateral and multilateral agencies made that same commitment. And I do think that there is some sort of responsibility to put the flesh on that policy and to work together with civil society organizations to really articulate what that should mean in practice. If it's underdefined at the moment, that's an opportunity to define it, and to also try to influence the government to then also export this idea that it ought to become a norm in all international development assistance, that organizations take a feminist approach. I think there's just a window of opportunity here which you should seize on as much as you can.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand back to CCIC.
Well, we just wanted to say thank you for coming and for contributing your wisdom and your experiences, and we wanted to give you a hand.